to give this seminar. It's an annual event. We usually give this seminar for our lecture seminar series and for master program. But this year we have combined it with the school seminar series. So I was thinking this morning what to say about Andre. It's very difficult what not to say about Andre. And he's done everything, if you read his bio, it's easy to say while he's done psychology, biology, and computer science, mathematics, and cognitive psychology, and various very high-profile universities. So his publication is enviable. He's internationally renowned, and everywhere you go in conferences, when your Andre's around, you got lots of people around him all the time. He's a lovable chap, they call it in England. So the only thing I remember about him and comparing with myself, when I had a sabbatical, I visited 3 countries in 1 week. But he only had a sabbatical, he visited 14 countries in about a year. But he spent times in many countries. He spent the times a week in London with me. So, as a director, he's been a quite powerful force for us, and expanding the department in terms of the capacity of the students and the faculty. So, there's nothing I can say here anymore. That we're delighted to have him to give this lectures and this seminar. And his topic of interest in AI and human factors is internationally renowned. Thank you, Andre. Thank you for your time.
Okay,
so, you can take it away.
Thanks for the nice introduction. So my presentation today is entitled The Human Factors of AI in Healthcare. Where are we now and where are we headed? So I've worked in both areas, and we'll see why I ended up doing that. But looking at both, human factors and AI have both had a very long and intertwined history. And what I wanted to show is that the success or failure of AI applications in healthcare is very closely related to the usability of the applications and how well they were thought out to fit or not with the workflow of healthcare. I also want to talk about methods for increasing the chance of success for AI in healthcare based on considerations of how to best integrate AI technology with humans. So that's why I see the two as very related. So I just like to look at some definitions. Human factors as a field, this is from the Electrical Engineering Association, is human factors is a scientific discipline concerned with understanding of the interactions among humans and other elements of a system in order to optimize human well-being. And we can replace the word system as being another technology, a medical device, another person, a team, even an organization. So we see this definition fits very well with looking at, for example, human-robotic interaction or other types of AI. If we drill down from human factors to define the term human-computer interaction as being a subfield of human factors that came about once we had digital computing, my favorite definition is from the Association for Computing Machinery, that human-computer interaction, HCI, as we abbreviate it, is a discipline concerned with the design, evaluation, and implementation of interactive computing systems for human use and with the study of major phenomena surrounding them. So as we'll see, this is going to be another area where AI and human factors are going to be very closely related. Also, some other considerations before we get into it. When designing for human-computer interaction in healthcare, whether we're designing electronic health records, clinical decision support or AI applications. We always consider it's quite difficult because of the number of factors. The complexity of healthcare, the fact that information is uncertain, it's often ambiguous, and many of the problems are ill-structured. We have well-defined problems, but we also have a large number of ill-defined problems in doing diagnosis or treatment or other activities in healthcare. We have the issue of local needs and variations on how things are done in different locations in the same country or across countries in terms of processes, everything. And last but not least, we have multiple and varied users and uses of systems. So arguably, healthcare is the most challenging domain for integrating any advanced technology, let alone AI applications. So a bit about my background. In another life a long time ago, before I got into healthcare, when I graduated with my master's in computers, it was the late 1980s, and I became then what was known as a knowledge engineer. So what was a knowledge engineer? The concept was we would acquire knowledge from experts in building expert system, AI expert systems. And we built a lot of them. I ended up working in the transportation industry for CP Rail. I worked with Imperial Hydro on nuclear reactor project, developing these so-called expert systems. In medicine, at the time, I wasn't working in healthcare, but I was well aware that almost every major medical school in the world at the time were developing medical expert systems. But by 1990, it was kind of clear that most of them ended up becoming prototypes and not going into actual use. And we'll discuss then and now as well. And for my career, what moved me into human factors was actually a paper in 1990 called The Demise of the Greek Oracle Model of Clinical Decision-Making. And we'll see why it was called that. It was written by the developers, Randy Miller and Mazuri, who developed a well-known AI system at the time called Imprimis that contained most of the knowledge in Harrison's internal medicine textbook. Is huge. But they even realized that people weren't using it in practice. So they wrote a 2-page editorial that the basic argument was that clinicians at the time wanted their decision-making supported and not replaced by a system. The model then was a physician entered the information in the system and it came up with a diagnosis or treatment plan automatically. But rather, he argued physicians wanted a catalyst to help them solve their problems in their work. So at that point, I thought, well, this is really a human factors issue. And the implication was, I thought, in order to support human cognitive processes, you need to understand those processes. So that led me to go to McGill and work on the area of cognitive science at McGill to understand cognitive processes to address this. It was also a time that other things were happening. At the time, some of you may have heard the term AI whimper. Apparently, we've had a few of those. I hit the one in 1990. At that point, there were so many inflated expectations about AI that we had to rename what we were doing or we wouldn't get grant funded at the time. So that was called the AI whimper. I hit the 1990 one and had to repurpose myself, I felt. So I moved into healthcare and human factors. But we'll see where there's some parallels today. So since then, of course, there have been an ever-increasing range and scope of AI technologies. Unlike what we hear in the media, AI is not one technology, it's a whole set of them that have been examined and developed through departments in computer science and AI and psychology around the world for decades. So AI, to begin with, is many technologies and many research areas, each having its own history, its own trajectory, and its own set of expectations. One of the areas I worked in at the time was knowledge representation, where we developed frameworks for adding object orientation to rules. That later on became known as intelligent databases or deductive databases. and to some extent went mainstream for complicated databases, like in areas like nuclear power, which is why I was working in that area. But the joke at the time was when something became mainstream, it was no longer called AI. Natural language processing, speech recognition, decades and decades of work in this. Machine learning is just much longer than recently, although it's really, the term has maybe come back and data mining. Neural nets have been around for a number of decades, but have really come into focus with better computing power and better approaches. We'll talk about some of the limitations in that today. Predictive analytics in healthcare, predictive monitoring of ICU patients. We can consider that AI. Likewise, intelligent bedside monitoring, and I'll make a case for that as well. A big automation area that is currently changing healthcare dramatically is automated image processing and analysis. For radiology, pathology, dermatology, that's something we're not waiting for, it's happening currently. Big data analytics requires AI algorithms, and we couldn't be even doing bioinformatics or genomic applications without it. So there's been a lot of work that never died out, it just continued in different forms. Some of you may be familiar. Has anyone seen this one, the Gartner? I like this Gartner hype cycle. It's from the Gartner group, and they do these cycles for different technologies. This one, they did in 2019 for AI technologies. And back to my theme that AI isn't one thing, it's multiple technologies. They placed on this curve different technologies. And the curve goes from, on the left-hand axis, from innovation trigger, when the innovation comes in, to what's known as a peak of inflated expectations. Eventually, reality sets in, and we drop into the trough of disillusionment. And over time, if the technology has value, we gain more realistic expectations, and we reach, on the curve on the right-hand side, the plateau of productivity. And having been involved in AI then and keeping track of it since for several decades, it really applies. I mean, at the top of the peak there, they had chatbots, which are probably going to be going the downturn for a while and then back up when we become more realistic. Notice on the plateau of productivity, they locate speech recognition. Well, the peak of it, we might have said, was earlier, several decades ago. I remember in the 80s and 90s, it was projected within a decade from then, they would have natural language processing systems that could really understand conversations deeply. And I would argue that we don't have those today. There are a lot of commercial applications of natural language processing, hence it's on the plateau of productivity, but they're often in much more constrained domains. So I'm interested in looking at where adoption has occurred and what are the patterns. So before I go into what currently working on, I did a paper on this, if anyone's interested, reflecting on what some of the issues were back then and are they still existent now in different ways. One of the biggest issues back then with AI was the issue of trust and legal liability. This is the issue of what if the AI makes a mistake. And in human factors, we refer to this as failure mode. And we can compare human failure mode to machine failure mode. When I worked in industry on transportation applications, we had developed, for example, a system that analyzed diesel locomotive failure. It was an expert system that we found at a higher success rate at accurately diagnosing the engine failure than the humans. However, the errors were different than the errors that the humans made. So the system didn't get adopted because the humans that were doing that argued that somehow the errors the computer made were worse than their errors, which we never really calculated, but that was the argument. So this will come into play even today. When we look at self-driving and autonomous cars, they claim they'll be safer. I don't think we'll know until they're all on the road. And we may have this effect as well, that even if they were statistically shown as safer, if the accidents are more dramatic, there may be issues about their adoption. And again, that was something that's probably being overhyped, and we're a bit behind schedule having them on the roads all over, according to the pioneers of that. Second one, knowledge acquisition. Back in the 80s, this was an issue. This is where we had come up with the term of knowledge engineer to pan the gold from the expert's mind and put it in the system. So this was carrying forward to today. There are a lot of issues in acquiring knowledge to put in clinical guidelines. And even when we look at things like neural nets, the issue comes up. More quantitative today, but what do we train the system on? Where does the data set come from? Is the data generalizable? So it's kind of come back in a different way. Another issue, human understandable explanation capability. In order to have trust in the system, early expert systems produced rules training that would show you how it deduced this conclusion. Today we have issues here. If we have complex neural networks that are more like activation patterns, it's a bit difficult to show the user that the explanation is valid, although we might be able to show experts and validate the system. And this actually was the topic of an earlier seminar presentation just on this topic several weeks ago. My interest was on HCI interaction modes and models, looking at either how embedded or ubiquitous is the application, or how interactive is it, or does it have to be with human health professionals. This one came up again, I'll show you on my next slide, surprisingly. Back then was the issue of integrating AI with existing systems. So rather than having to re-enter into an AI system, that everything was integrated and work processes. So for example, AI systems should be integrated with electronic health records. And this is still a fumbling problem today. I've mentioned the issue of generalization, where AI systems were found, some of the classic ones, to work in a specific location, the specific country or specific type of clinic, and the same results were not obtained in terms of accuracy or efficiency when the same system was transplanted to another location. And this is another issue that I have found, again, I have a paper on this, in some of the current applications of AI, the issue of generalizability. And last but not least, the need for common sense reasoning and the application of world knowledge to support reasoning at a deeper level when it's required in the problem-solving process. So we need to know when you switch from a system to the human or the human to the system, vice versa. Again, I view this as an issue of human-computer interaction. So one last background slide. Fast forward to 2020 recurrent issues. Some of you may be familiar with IBM Watson. It was well known because it beat the game Jeopardy a few years ago. And the idea was that it would contain a knowledge base that includes machine language, natural language processing, that could intake information and provide expert opinion. In the area of medicine, the one they developed that was most well known is called IBM Watson Oncology, that provides treatment options. And actually in 2017, I was contacted by IBM to do some studies of how the system works in the natural settings of healthcare practice, which was surprising to me because at that point, they had done quite a few studies showing that it was accurate and effective, but there had been actually few HCI studies of the type I described today, even given the large amount of money that went into it at the time. And I just included there an example of an article that came out in 2017. MD Anderson in Texas had implemented IBM Watson and hit a number of issues, some of them to do with human factors about how the system would be integrated into the workflow, how would it be used as a consulting mode or otherwise. There were issues about localization. Many of the physicians there and in other parts of the US found that the information was acquired mostly from Sloan Kettering, I was told, in New York, didn't fit with the way they did things there, either their guidelines or their cultural practices in dealing with cases. And last but not least, they were undergoing at MD Anderson implementation of a new EMR, and they found out that when they tried to transport the system over, there were a lot of issues about that integration. So that was a recurrent issue decades later. But from my reading of that, the lesson learned was that you need to prove the technologies work in the real setting, and again, need for consideration of human factors and the user technology interaction. So I don't want to be too negative, so I want to move on to solutions. I always look at solutions from a lens of usability and human factors. So what can we learn from human-computer interaction and human factors and for improving and increasing our probability of adopting systems AI? So looking at it from a usability lens. And for me, most useful definition of usability is looking at usability of any system along about 5 dimensions. And in developing studies, I focus on one or more of these dimensions, as you will see. One is learnability of the system. How easy or difficult is it to learn how to use the system? 2 is effectiveness. Does the system do what it's supposed to and do it accurately? 3, efficiency. Does it do it efficiently? Does it require you to re-enter all the information, or is it saving you time? Satisfaction is the end user's perception of usage. And last but not least, safety, which keeps coming back over and over again when we're looking at some of these applications. So this was useful for designing usability studies, but I've also found it useful as a framework for looking at evaluation of AI systems, as all of the above dimensions are essential for AI success. We also have the more recent term user experience, which includes even more about the user's expectations, and usability I consider a subset of user experience. So what has our work involved? From usability testing to clinical simulations. So I've kind of promoted what I call low-cost, rapid usability engineering. The idea you don't need an expensive usability lab, and in fact, you want the techniques for doing studies to be easy enough to take into any setting, any hospital, any lab, any operating room, anywhere in the world. So that's doable nowadays. And the idea of usability testing is simple. We observe representative users, doctors and physicians, could be somebody working, for example, with an AI application, doing representative tasks, for example, in a rounds meeting or making a diagnosis or treatment plan. And we typically do this with full audio and video recording of what's going on the screen, what people are saying, and we merge that onto a video track we can analyze. To make things more realistic, I've worked with Elizabeth Bricky on this, and the term clinical simulations, we define it as clinical simulation is observing representative users doing representative tasks, and we add in the real or realistic settings. So this is doing those studies in the real clinics, in the real operating rooms. We could do it off hours if we're doing a simulation, or continue monitoring if we're looking at collecting data on integration of systems in real use. Bob and Mary was just a slide of a project we did about 10 years ago where we analyzed introduction of barcoding and decision support in the hospital in Japan. So I'm going to talk a bit about this slide later, how we can collapse different methodologies into one suite of evaluations in design and evaluation of AI. I'll get to that in a minute. But we can talk about the fidelity of doing this analysis from, on the left-hand side, the laboratory, with which we can control things, but less realistic. In the middle, what we call clinical simulations, as I've mentioned. That's a slide there from a simulation lab in Denmark that was set up for testing health IP, information technology. And on the right-hand side, we can actually go in situ and record using different unobtrusive recording methods, use of technology, in real setting during early release. We particularly like to do that, but even after it's gone past that and for more widespread release. Another thing based on that, we developed a kind of a model I won't get into, but this has been very useful for doing consulting work, not just for AI, but for electronic health record systems, clinical decision support, is that if you're looking at the interaction, I always like to start with looking at it in 3 layers, starting at the bottom where it's less constrained, but becomes more open-ended as we go up. Looking at the user interacting with the system in isolation. As we'll see in my examples, this could be simply having a single user sit down with an application, an AI application, thinking aloud and using it to solve a problem, and then analyzing the impact of the system, where there may be suboptimal processes or where there may be different insertion points for the technology. But that won't prove it works in the real world. So we often move up to the level 2, which is we can optimize at level 1. Level 2 is optimizing it at the level of putting the technology in the real work environment and analyzing how it works and supporting, for example, clinical activities. And then finally, if we may want to go up to a higher level of looking at multiple users interacting with the system at a higher organizational level. Usually I cut out at that point because we get into more ethnography and other methods. On the right-hand side, I indicated some of the methods that we employ. So I give an example of 3 examples I want to give how we've been working with different types of applications. The first one was looking at automated clinical guidelines embedded in a real live system in use in a hospital in New York City. The second example is some work we're doing on this digital supercluster project on trying to integrate AI into dermatology for identifying cancerous moles. And the third example is work in progress. We're working on developing a smart home lab down the hall in our building where we can try out technologies used for virtual care that involve AI and other technologies. So the first example is about clinical decision support automatically triggered when conditions are detected in the system for different conditions like pneumonia, strep throat, etc. So this was a project at Mount Sinai Hospital, New York, called ICPR, Integrated Clinical Decision Support. Our objective was to ensure that the CBS doesn't impede workflow and leads to better clinical outcomes. And this system had a suite of tools, including an alert that is triggered by relevant information input into the EHR that activates the algorithm to assess automatically whether support is needed. There is a calculator that provides information, interacts with the user about risk of different conditions based on clinical prediction rules. There's also a component called a smart set that provides an automatic list of recommended ordering, bundle ordering sets for procedures or drugs, a number of components. So these are all the screenshots of what would appear on top of and layered on top of an EHR. So we're looking at integration of this input in EHR. At the top left will pop up, for example, if the system determined that it was likely a strep throat. So the end user sees this pop up on the screen, clicks on accept if they want. They can, as I say, blow it away, but if they click accept, there is, you can see there a flow sheet where there's questions asked after the end user. A few simple questions is applying a clinical predictive rule. And if you answer them in the pattern predicted for strep throat, then the arrow moves over to the middle pop-up, which is, for example, high probability of strep throat. And then you can click accept if you want, and then it immediately moves you to the far right screen, which gives you what you can select for treating that as a recommendation from the system. So clinical decision support nowadays is often an integrated suite like this. So our interest was, can we optimize it and make sure it's working properly before releasing? So again, just to illustrate how we use the three approaches, we did this all within the span of packaging everything within about 1 or 2 months for doing this type of a beta collection. The analysis took longer. But at level 1, what I did was I actually went to New York and sat down in the offices of 8 physicians who interacted with the system, and we had created a script that forced them through it. We recorded the screens and what they responded to as the screens were going through. But that would determine low-level usability problems. But we were really interested also as well in the interaction between the human and the machine interaction. So after doing level 1 testing, we did a level 2 testing in order to simulate a real interaction. We created a digital patient that the physicians could interact with. And that way they could ask questions in the order they wanted, and it would trigger in a more natural way. So we could look at that, how it's being triggered in the interaction with the physician. Trigger being when it gets invoked. And at the third level, and at every level, we've been optimizing. We make fixes, move back. And at the third level, we did some testing we call near live with some almost live scenarios, and then also kept the recording going when it went live, optimized again, and then the system went to a randomized clinical trial. One group got it, one group didn't. So in this diagram, unlike a lot of testing or evaluation of IP systems, rather than doing a half-baked optimization of the system and then putting it out to a trial where one group gets it, one group doesn't, which in my opinion leads to spurious results because we haven't optimized systems. I think which leads to differences in the same system having different outcomes in different locations. The reports often don't say how well they optimize them before they let them loose. In this example, we started with the prototype implementation overlaid on the EHR, went to level 1 testing, which was the end user, single users, did redesign fixes, moved to level 2 of the clinical simulation, did the fixes, and then released it as a clinical trial to hundreds of users. And that was another story, another paper. But we found, lo and behold, high adoption rates because we actually gone through these processes before releasing the system. So in analyzing it, it was quite interesting watching what people were doing on the screen. There were usability issues, and to code the video, we come up with definitions for codes and examples coded statements, and we can quantify them as well. So usability referred to commentary about perceived effectiveness, efficiency, ease, or lack of ease. So example, it's becoming a lot of clicking and reading. If we want to do things quickly and we're patient waiting, it can be a problem. Visibility was a very interesting one. One of the users from the very first study said that they didn't react to the pop-up alarm. And we asked them why, and they said, well, either they didn't see it at the top of the screen, or it popped up with BPA written on it. And at the time, this was new at that hospital, so people didn't know what BPA meant. It was culturally a term used in Wisconsin, best practice advisory. Now they do, because they argue when I go there that there's too many of these damn things popping up. But the user in this case said, I just see BPA here. Normally I wouldn't see it. I don't usually look here. It should be more prominent when it popped up. So those are low-level issues. Any of them alone would have precluded use of the system. So we optimized those and then looked at workflow. This was a code for workflow, which refers to commentary on the order and sequence of tasks and the activities. And this user said, when we did the simulations of the interactions with patient, I think it depends on when we start using the tool, because if you use it right from the beginning, you get distracted and forget to go through other questions. I think these order sets should come in when we ask for them, not from the walk-in diagnosis. And when we whip out a simulation, we found we were doing it as it really would occur, that if something triggered in the system that might be pneumonia, for example, it would move into propping up the alert, if the risk calculator indicated a high level of pneumonia, it could quickly move into recommending the medication set or the set. And in some cases, the physician said, it's moving me to that conclusion, but I haven't even seen an x-ray yet. So we have to look at the triggering of the alerts coming automatically, and we're very sensitive. And when we add more alerts, it becomes even more complex. So this is what we found. If we were going to increase adoption, this had to be examined. I won't get into this. I mentioned we optimize at every level, optimizing the triggering of it. Just point out the graph on the right. There's two graphs there with bars. On the right are the different clinical support components. The alert component is one bar, the calculator component, the smart set is another. And we just coded those for positive and negative statements. And we can see that there were a lot of black for the bar for the alert. People didn't like it popping up. And they now visiting that hospital 10 years later, these occur so frequently that it becomes what we call alert fatigue or cognitive overload we have to deal with. The calculator, though, is a smaller bar, but it's mostly white. People like interacting with the calculator and found it useful, in some cases, even going into the system only to access the calculator. And the smart sets had the variable reaction. A lot of them you could modify the recommendation, but felt that they came up too early or were too obtrusive in their decision-making process, guiding them too early. Some people only wanted that to come up as a check on what they were doing. And this just shows we're able to analyze the different stages of people working through a case in terms of, are they in the progress mode? Are they looking at diagnosis or orbis? And looking at graphically determining different trigger points. So that was one example of using clinical decision support, which, as you know, is kind of grew out of rule-based AI. It kind of morphed into behind-the-scenes rules that run clinical decision support, best practice guidelines, and we got our feet wet with applications like this with that project, as I said, about 10 years ago. A current one with some similar issues come up is one I'm working on. Colleague Elizabeth Bricky and a whole group of companies in BC. It's called the Dermatology Point-of Care Intelligent Network. The objective is earlier diagnosis of skin cancer using machine learning and AI. So what is our objective? And I emphasize the word effectively, to effectively integrate AI-based imaging system into a province-wide healthcare system. As I mentioned, this is part of something called Canada Digital Supercluster. And the technology is there. We're working with a company, and they've been referenced in the Lancet for the accuracy of having a high level of accuracy in scanning images and identifying potential melanomas. The nice part about this system is if you take a picture of the mole, the AI engine analyzes it, and then in the physician's office will bring up a risk along with images of similar moles that pulls out, kind of case-based reasoning that were diagnosed as melanoma, leaving it to, again, to the physician to decide what to do at that point. But as I said, and this is being implemented in some hospitals in California and Australia. We're slow at getting it implemented in Canada for a number of reasons I kind of get to, but highly accurate system. But the biggest problem is how can this be integrated into primary care physicians across the province? The technology is there. That's not the biggest issue. And why we want to do this is, as you know, in Canada, we have horribly long wait lists in many places, as I am very well aware of. Patients may wait months to see a specialist, a dermatologist. And if you have or have ever had cancer, every day waiting for something can lead to progression of that cancer. It can happen very quickly, as I'm well aware of. And so it doesn't hit you until you think about that, the problem of the wait time. So we looked at this as a potential solution. Can upload photos from a smartphone, take them in the primary care office or the patient themselves, help with near immediate analysis by this AI imaging software, working with a PowerCom. Initially, we're going to work with PowerCom to create, it was going to create a memories bank. So again, with this theme of workflow, we looked at the current workflow. The primary care exam, you go to your doctor, GP, that might wait a long time to get there. In fact, some people don't even have GPs. Wait to get referred to a specialist, a dermatologist. When we did the proposal for this, we found that in the interior, there was like one dermatologist could wait months to get there. Then we might get a biopsy, wait for the results, etc. So we can see this could be rather lengthy period in the worst case. So the AI engine is inserted. The initial model was not that the patient would do it by themselves, but in the doctor's office, the primary care and the patient would use the tool, take the picture, the AI engine would do an assessment, and if it was high risk, then the GP could order the biopsy or send to the dermatologist. But this could really cut things down. So this is the insertion points we're looking at. And in fact, with COVID, the issue came up of maybe we won't have face-to-face consultations as much. So can we go right from the patient taking the photograph directly to the AI engine? Of course, keeping the GP in the loop. So these are the issues that we're looking at in the project. And as I said, the AI is part of it, and so is the human-computer interaction. And some other examples is looking at systems like this that could flag potential melanoma and indicate it as a potential melanoma in a problem list. So I'll skip through that. Have a next slide. The suspected cancer automatically alerting it and putting it in the problem list in the EMR. Again, we have to look at how this will work from a human factors point of view. And finally, working on developing a more complete pathway from identification, flagging to full patient follow-through. So the project also involves the company providing information to the patient about what's going on with the case at the same time. Okay. Oh, my slide didn't move. Okay, the last example I quickly mentioned is not really an example because it's a work in progress. As I mentioned, we're developing a virtual smart home down the hall. What is a smart home? Here's a floor plan. We got a $200,000 grant to set up a simulated one-bedroom apartment that has a kitchen, a living room, it will have a smart TV. We had a company donate sensors. Sensor technology now is actually quite cheap, and we can get it at places like Best Buy. Sensors that you can put on the fridge, that when contact is broken, indicate the fridge is being opened. We can correct data. If a senior is gone home, living alone, it can correct data on how often they eat, how often they're sleeping, how they're sleeping, etc. Eating, other things, how often plumbing is used. And it provides an alert to the caregiver or the health professionals over the cell phone if there's a problem. So this technology, we're working with it on how we can integrate AI, other areas, speech recognition, data analytics. Oh yeah, I have that in my next slide. We're looking at developing use cases in the smart home. One area, a very good one, is speech recognition and natural language processing for commands. I was at a presentation in Australia where a company had developed an excellent home setup. The example they gave was someone who had most of his body burnt in the fires in Australia, had artificial limbs, couldn't use them, but was using speech recognition to turn the shower on and off. Context-sensitive health around the home, what are the possibilities? If we're collecting all this data, it's no good if no one can analyze it. We're working with companies that aren't necessarily in the loop with the hospital, although we're also working with a project called Hospital at Home. But for automated analysis of interactions, we need to summarize a lot of the data, looking at sleep patterns, coming up with alerts or reminders, sort of like the sleep analysis or EKG analysis and intelligent monitoring. And automated alerting or reminding about healthy patterns, someone in the home that has Alzheimer's, or coming up with purchasing a smart fridge that's more like a computer. I've never seen a fridge like this in my life. It's absolutely unbelievable. And not the clinical decision support, we're not talking about the clinic, the patient decision support will be phenomenal. So we're also going to be using a technique, I'm doing a special issue on something called patient journey mapping, which is in essence mapping out the workflow that patients take in their daily lives, again, using that as a map for insertion points for different technologies, when to support AI support or automated analytics. So I don't have a lot of time, I just have a few take homes on a few slides. So the question becomes when and how to integrate AI into health. Well, as we've seen, it has to be inserted for a task that AI is proven to be good at, has to be useful, saves time, increases accuracy, leads to better outcomes. It must integrate into workflow, and we must consider how it affects work practices, now the patient journey if they're in the loop, and ultimate decision-making. I promote this a three-phase approach to evaluating AI system usability, where we move on the left from laboratory-based testing to clinical simulations to real-life scenarios. Now, we can never predict everything, so we still want to monitor once it's gone live, but by doing this, we reduce the risk of unpleasant surprises, technology-induced errors, or legal liability and litigation. And I'll tell you, hospitals are really concerned about this. I was at a conference last summer in California with the top people in AI presenting, and the biggest panel was a panel of lawyers, because we had people there from the health organizations that were saying, what's my legal liability with these systems? And last year, it was very unclear. The FDA certifies products, but a lot of these products weren't certified. They haven't got the people with skills to even certify them at the moment. We were kind of having a grace period where people could use it. But what was explained to me is having FDA approval is very important. If something untoward happens and the patient dies, legal liability is a lot less if you can say we had an FDA approved product. So not a trivial issue for making this real. Human-computer interaction modes, consulting is one. We consult. It may critique what you have to say. We can augment human perception, extending physical access. Robotic surgery is really changing surgery, although it's more of an interaction between the human and the system. It's not like the robot does all the work. It's a nice dual interaction. Some systems could run completely in the background. You may not know they're there, especially if they've proven to be effective. And then other ones, as I've mentioned, alerting and reminding, are really a direct extension of rule-based AI, which, as I said in the beginning, when something becomes mainstream, they often don't even call it AI anymore. And machine learning and knowledge discovery. So we all have heard about neural nets, and some of you work with them. A research issue is how do we understand or validate this information that comes from it at the human end? And can human understandable explanations be created from these types of applications? And I have a PhD student working on this. It's a research area. The book hasn't been written on how to do this. We have a presentation a couple of weeks ago in this area as well. So it's research. I like to probably develop frameworks. So looking at a framework for classifying AI applications in healthcare. One is the system's intended mode of functioning. 2 is the mode that advice is offered. 3 is the consultation style. 4 is what is the underlying engine. As I said, there are many, many variations on all of these technologies. And 5, last but not least, the human-computer interaction issues. If you want to adopt it, you have to consider all of these. And I just also like doing continuums, so I have one here on interaction mode of the human roles with AI. On the left-hand side, the more the consulting and human decision support end. On the right-hand side, the more the autonomous and independent self-contained mode. And some of you are familiar with robotic surgery, like the Da Vinci system. It's work with the surgeon controls it, but highly automated as well. Consulting systems like IBM, I mentioned Watson and Corbsey, will be on the left-hand side. Alerts and reminders, further in the middle, they run in the background until they detect the problem and then interact with the user. And on the right-hand side, some things that most useful ones we don't even see or hear about, I include here intelligent bedside monitoring, analyzing vast data like EKGs. I used to work in sleep research. It can analyze sleep waves instead of hours manually in seconds, and can make adjustments automatically. And as I said, often that then doesn't become termed AI anymore. This becomes use. So I've mentioned where it's being adopted, where it makes life easier, providing data that can't otherwise be obtained, providing overview of data for rapid decision making that would otherwise leave the cognitive lobe or take too long for human processing. Often forgotten, we often look at the glamorous applications, but can we provide support for previous or time-consuming administrative functions? Documentation burden is a big issue right now. Can we focus on that, not just on more glamorous diagnosis and treatment? Processing for support of large data streams, data analytics, mentioned before, alerts and reminders. And an interesting case study on its own is the use of AI in pathology, radiology, and dermatology, with radiology being transformed with pre-processing of images that can show the radiologist where to look and circle, identify areas on the scan. So it doesn't necessarily be a complete diagnosis by the system, but that interaction, again, because a human-computer interaction has been more carefully designed, has more uptake. I've already mentioned having FDA approval might be good, but that won't be enough to sort of box them either. As I said, I mentioned these, what the attributes are of being adopted. Last but not least, being usable. Other human-computer interaction issues, the human-machine partnership issue, as I've shown the continuum, from more computer-aided work to autonomous agents. And we have a lot of parallels here to automation and control issues in aviation. If you follow the Boeing MAX 737 about automated control, there was a bug in it, but it took control over the human, etc. And Airbus always had these issues of over-automating and what to do about it, what's the right balance. And I talked to people working in robotic surgery. I saw a presentation by a pioneer in this in California last summer, Dr. Fong, and he was talking about working with the companies on that, developing a balance. These are million-line programmed code to develop these systems. And we want to understand what about the system that changes, what about the human, or what we want to change about both. Again, we should take a more scientific approach. And I'll just end with HCI and mainstream adoption. Bringing AI into mainstream healthcare will require more practical and rigorous approaches to applying HCI in designing and implementing, and also a better understanding of the needs of different types of users, especially as patients and consumers begin to use AI applications. Although it's rather weak AI, some of you may have heard of Babylon, and there's AI chatbots out there now, symptom checkers for use by patients. So it's moving away from just looking at clinical. More of my studies now are beginning to look at patients interacting with devices. And talking about needs of different users, I always like to mention, many of you are familiar with Rogers' diffusion of innovation model, that we can look at users of systems on a normal curve. Some small percent of users are the innovators or adopters. These are often the computer enthusiasts. And when we go to an AI conference in medicine, you often hear from them presenting. That's why the one I went to last summer, what I thought was really balanced, that had administrators, legal people as well. And very important to get the ball rolling. But then we move into the early adopters, the early majority of people using in the normal curve, most people using in the middle, the late majority are people that pick up later on. And finally, we have the laggards, or the people that don't want to use it unless they're forced to. And we can look at this curve for any technology, like electronic health records, clinical decision support, or any other AI technology. And the sigmoid shape S curve is the curve of the actual number of users. And over with technologies, we find that's the orange curve, find the yellow, a shaped curve like that. And I'll just end with, we can look at those curves for adoptions for any number of technologies. And we see over time, this went from everything from power steering to the microwave to the internet, the tablet, and the cell phone, social media, that the curves for these are spanning shorter and shorter periods. There's faster uptake to achieve that S curve. But what we hope we can do is speed up adoption curves for AI technologies. But my argument has been this will require a much greater emphasis and consideration of human factors to do it. So we can, instead of taking decades, we can do things a little bit more timely. So my conclusion is increased consideration of human factors is essential, and the success of AI will depend on the extent to which the technologies designed are both useful and usable and fit with human work activities. And that's my end of it. Okay, thanks. Open for any questions if we have time. Or if we have time to stay around, I do. If not.
We have time, and if you want to put any questions either on chat or put your hands up and then speak. Any taker?
There's a question in the chat, Abdul.
Okay, question in the chat. Jeremy Wyatt. Jeremy, are you around to ask the questions or shall I?
Hi, Jeremy.
Hi, Andre. Thanks very much indeed for an excellent talk. Really interesting and very useful update on current thinking in HCI. So my question is about that traditionally, and obviously I'm not an HCI person, but my understanding is that traditionally HCI focused on psychology of individual users.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of people like Donald Norman, for example, with his design of everyday things. It's all about individual psychology. But increasingly, I've seen, certainly on this side of the Atlantic, people like Carl May with his normalization process theory, Trish Greenhalgh, who first trained as a sociologist before becoming a GP, coming up with another theory, her non-adoption abandonment, etc., the NAS framework. And they're looking as sociologists at teams of people and even organizations and organizational culture. So, for example, normalization, I think, is something about groups, peer groups, and communities of practice. So that's not taking a psychological perspective, that's taking a sociological perspective and coming up with some useful in how digital health and e-health are adopted or not. And I just wonder whether you could comment on the links between your approach coming from HCI and that more sociological approach, and potentially is there a gap, is there something in the middle that's missing to try and connect these two approaches? Thanks.
Yeah. My comment is that very interesting you mentioned about perspectives from psychology. I remember when I was doing my doctorate in psychology, it was a big thing and moving from individual cognition, and as you know, the term distributed cognition came up. Hudson's work on distributed cognition, and I know May Tremors there, she was at McGill when we were studying it together. And it was like, oh, this is a big breakthrough. What's done for decision making isn't the individual, it's a group. And that was for me, really important. And I look at HCI very broadly. I'm looking at it, I have the three-layer model here, maybe not the top level. The level 3 I kind of see as Carl May's area of a sociological perspective. And often I don't go that far up the ladder. But I definitely, from what I've been saying, you see, I've been talking about workflow, for example, as part of usability. And I know a lot of the sort of old school HCI people kind of look at more of the ergonomic, how do I lay out the screen? I'm kind of going more workflow as part of usability. And that's kind of, as you said, I think in the middle, moving up from the individual to the middle, and then moving up to the sociological level. And I found this very useful framework, and it wasn't even theoretically derived. I would often call them to do consulting when EHR systems didn't work. And I remember one in New York, nobody could use it. Couldn't tell you why. So we recorded them using it one by one, single users. And we found half the time the cursor blinked, we could enter, half the time we couldn't. So we had hundreds of what I coded consistency out. We fixed that. It flew, it went right up to level 2. We packed it with the patients in the room to carry out the task. It worked fine, and that was it. Our work was over. But on many projects, we can optimize at the level 1, That's why I want to wrap all 3 evaluations into one set. Then go to level 2, because level 1 doesn't mean level 2 is going to work when we have more than one person. Then we go to optimizing the small group of the doctor with the patient and the computer. And I got into work on doctor-patient computer interaction video taping that through that. But then you can still have it that someone doesn't want to use the system or the group. And then we get into, I kind of move off at that point and send them elsewhere, that maybe the system has modified the power balance in the clinic, the gatekeepers say, and then we're up to level 3. So I've been trying to think of how we can reduce those gaps so that somebody doesn't say, well, I tested it and worked fine, and then no one wants to use it. Particularly with the ones that are just tested, as I said, IBM had done work on more like trials of efficiency, accuracy of IBM Watson, but I was kind of surprised that there was a gap in the level 2. They hadn't done that when they called me in 2017. So it was like, wow, they spent hundreds, it was millions of dollars on that project. And then they hit the same old kind of roadblocks I saw when I did the old expert systems in the 80s. Can we not learn?
Thank you,
Great,
Jeremy,
thanks.
for your question, and thank you,
Oh, and
Andre.
Jeremy, I really like your presentation. We have to talk because I think we're kind of heading in the same direction on the evaluation side.
Great, thanks. I'm just if I'm allowed time, I'm
Sure.
just thinking that there is a bridging discipline between individual psychology and sociology, and I guess it's social psychology.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of the work of people like Michael Argyle. I don't know if you know of that name. He was in Oxford probably 20 years ago now, but he did quite a lot of experimental social psychology. How do people behave in groups? But he was looking at it from the psychological perspective as opposed to the sociological perspective. So he was interested in attitudes and the kind of constructs that psychologists talk about rather than, for example, power and communication and so on, as sociologists do. And it's just a thought. I'll stop there. And in fact, I need to go and get my supper. It's 7 o'clock.
It's great. Yeah.
But thanks. It's been a really great
Thanks for coming.
evening. Thanks very much indeed.
Yeah.
Take care, all of you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you. Let's talk to you soon. Any other questions, folks?
Sure, I have a question, if that's okay.
Who are you?
Ami Rav Devi.
Okay.
So I wanted to go back to the regulatory piece of this in terms of talking about the pressures from that side to accelerate usability testing. And your thoughts, Andre, on what an international kind of safety rating for health applications would look like, or how you would go about developing that framework, whether it be for a dermatology app or for retina scanning, similar to what we have for international rating for automobiles, that you can go to any country and you can get a safety rating on a car. Would you foresee something like that in healthcare for applications where whatever country you go to, there's kind of an accepted safety rating of specific AI technologies or specific apps that are being developed and implemented?
Good question. And that in my mind is a problematic area. In the US, we have the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, we have Health Canada. The EU has something called CE marking for certifying products. Software has been a real thorny issue, not just AI, but even electronic health records and decision support. The question, does it fall under that? How can they be evaluated? In terms of AI and that type of regulation or certification, as I said, it was last summer at the conference I went to in California where they had experts from legal and other areas. They were saying it was still a bit of a Wild West, that, and I also read somewhere, I don't know if Elizabeth's here, she showed me an article, that the FDA kind of, it was a bit of a grace period with these technologies. And from that conference, I heard some of the regulatory groups didn't even have the competencies for analyzing the algorithm from the inside, because some of the certifications require knowing what the engine is, not just the outputs. Otherwise, it's a black box. So there was kind of like, you could go and do this, but then the lawyers were saying, well, without proper certification, then there's liability if something goes wrong. So it's a bit, my take of it, if anyone knows otherwise, I'd love to talk to them. It's a bit up in the air. We do have to have better levels of testing and certification. Some of the newer technologies are problematic. So if we were doing something like neural nets for imaging, for radiology, then the model that's been more useful is the model of, for example, highlighting different sections on the scan that you might want to look at. That's a more acceptable model because it's a decision aid as opposed to a replacement. And we have to work on that continuum of what was the objective as aid or replacement. There's no onus if it's a replacement. And my read on it, unless there's been a lot of changes in the last year, a lot of that certification stuff is up in the air. And I'll just do a parallel to usability certification. Usability certification is very weak for EHRs and that. In fact, I wish they almost didn't have it. In the US, they certify products for usability, which basically means, like Sherman and Epic, that they went through the steps of doing some usability testing. All they have to do is sort of documentation. They don't have benchmarks. And in many cases, they don't even test with clinical users all the time. So, and the EU, I was told, had better certification of health IP products than that. And then I found out that the CE marking was very similar, that to get certified, we have to show you did some due diligence, fix some bugs that you found, know your benchmark, and still full of holes. But then companies can say, well, we're certified, but we're a good product. And that's also been a holdup because then, and some projects I wanted to work on, health authorities wanted me to work on them, but the companies involved said, no, we don't need the health, we're certified. I don't think they wanted us to really look at it too carefully.
Okay, Andre, we got a few more questions. If you're willing to stay and carry on. Kelly is next, and then Lon after Kelly, and then we have Dylan statements. Here we go.
Hi,
take away,
thank
Kelly.
you very much. Yeah, this is Kelly. I have so many questions, but I'll just limit myself
just
to
stick to one, and Andre response short as well, so that we get everyone in, if it's okay. Because I'm recording this also, I don't want the size of the recording to be huge. Okay.
Okay. So I'll do my best to make this short. So I think this builds on the last question as well. So when it comes to regulating AIs and just digital interventions in Canada broadly, what are your thoughts on how it may or may not fragment practice, and with that practice, access to healthcare? Because I see what I sort of see happening right now, and I may be wrong, is that technical innovation is being used in Canadian healthcare as a competitive advantage, meaning that some people may receive better care than others, and the users of those systems may be able to, to provide better care or not, depending on their level of digital literacy. I'll stop there. What do you think, Andre?
Well, there's a lot of potential. I mean, we could look at IP being double-edged sword, potential for democratization of healthcare. Tonight I'm going to a lecture in Berlin's class by a company called Babylon. I haven't seen the product yet. Some of you may have tried it that allows for symptom checking, I believe. I'll find out, but over the cell phone. And I haven't looked at that product, but right now in BC, I think there's something like 700,000 people that don't even have a GP. So if you don't have a GP, and my workflow for skin cancer, you can't even get people that you might wait before you even get to someone that might refer you to someone. So that tool apparently allows for a consultation. I heard within a day. I'll find out if you do this online by going directly to Babylon, or Palace runs it. Even if that system isn't perfect, that could fill a whole gap and make more accessibility for everyone than people that may have more money or whatever to get GPs. And in BC, it's so bad sometimes that even having a lot of money, I know people with lots of money who can't find the GP in Victoria. So it would make it could make things equal out if done properly. So it could be a glue that will help with virtualization of care. Other project I'm working on is called Hospital at Home with Island Health, and they're looking to use monitoring technologies to get people at home quicker and from not just chronic patients, but more acute, with self-monitoring at home, which will require alerts and other things. So I see a huge potential. We just have to stage it properly, test it properly, and refine it properly before we go to widespread use. But yeah, the potential is there to actually, I think, make things more democratic.
I think Babylon is widely used in the UK as well, and the routine.
Yeah, I'm not one thing about Babylon I did read, because back to the theme about organizational problems. I read in Wired magazine, they had an article about it and said the problem with it was that the doctors that were involved in it were getting a lot of patients, and they were healthier, younger, that were using cell phones, and they liked it, they got paid for that. The other doctors that weren't working with it were getting the harder deal with cases. It was redistributing how patients were seen by doctors, but that wasn't the technology game. It was the organizational human factors.
No, exactly, because I think that perceptions of those doctors who weren't involved with the Babylon, therefore they had a lot of complaint about it because they were getting more chronic patients. Anyway, that's it. But it sounds a good system to me.
Yeah, I've heard. Yeah.
And Lon, I think you have you.
Yeah, thank you. Really, really good talk. I'm curious if the human factors work that you do considers the human tendency to anthropomorphize and perceive computers as social actors, and whether that is, a vulnerability or an opportunity to develop, the interfaces in an intentional way.
Yeah, and that's where that's a continuum of the balance between how autonomous or behind the scenes is it, or how interactive. And obviously a system that you don't see and does some calculation in the background, those become buried. And once those get put in place, this becomes part of work that we expect that calculation to come out. But the applications that involve more interaction with the human then become, okay, what's the social presence? And then area I want to get more into is human-robot interaction. What is the presence of the robot? And I've seen some hospitals in Canada with robots, but they were almost more for display. I went to Humber leave from a hospital in Toronto, and they were told to be very automated. But of course, they have a robot at the front desk that greeted children coming in. And so that robot had a real social presence. And we'll have to see how far that goes. But yeah, that's the whole area, I think, as Jeremy Wright was saying, sociological aspects. And there's books being written on that now. I haven't read them on the sociological aspects of treating robots as part of a human group. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. And Dylan, is it a statement or that questions?
I guess, I don't know, a statement, I guess. It was, yeah, Andre, it was a great talk. Awesome topic. No, it's just like, I think you kind of answered that already with FDA, machine learning, and robotic surgery. It's kind of in those 3 layers that you're showing on the screen: usability testing, clinical simulation, and for certification. Is that kind of the main process for FDA for this kind of AI stuff?
I wouldn't say this process. I think you should do this process. I mean, my other argument is, even if you're FDA approved, I propose that this process be done at local hospitals, because approving something somewhere else with health IP doesn't mean it works in your hospital. So yeah, they have different methodologies. I think they're more into having come out of the Food and Drug Administration, they're more into clinical trials, for example. One clinical trial of a drug, one group gets, one group doesn't, of course. And a lot of, I think, the IP work has been based on expanding that to IP. But we need to go beyond that and look under the hood. And I think some issues they were having, I heard, was how do we look under the hood, something like the neural mat application. Yeah, so my take on that, I want to look into more what's happening with that, but as of last year, there were I found a lot more questions than I could get answers on.
I don't think we
Thanks.
have any other questions. Andre, just a quick questions for your dermatology system. Do you use just the normal photos of or do you use the images of the melanoma?
Well, right now it's going to be photo. They were going to have a tool. It's going to be done in the doctor's office called the dermatoscope. So it's a better quality image, but it's essentially my understanding a photograph that would go up, for example, in the cloud, be analyzed. But there was talk about, okay, maybe having that done directly from the patient. But I think one of the reasons, again, for acceptability, the initial model to be practical is don't throw the GP out of the loop, have it in the GP office, they're together, and then we can solve that. Because image quality in that, again, comes up as an issue.
So on that note, I want to thank Andre for excellent talk, bringing us a last 30 years in about 2 hours or an hour, and giving us his views of HCI related to AI and all the cognitive side of it. So Andre, thank you very much. A lot of people enjoyed it. Everyone enjoyed it, I think. And we had a big group as well in the audience from outside, from Europe, from Australia. They could probably sleep, but anyway, thank you so much. And so with a clap for Andre, and a digital clap, physical clap, and all welcome. Thank you, Andre.
I'm if you're interested in any of this, let me know. Okay, thanks.
More question, you can send it back to Andre. So my students stay, the rest I can go, and then I stop